December 1941. The waters off the Philippines. The hull groans, a deep metallic moan that is swallowed by the pressure of the Pacific. Below, the air is thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wes Brown, commander of the USS Stingray SS-186, grips the periscope handles, his eyes strained against the green glass. He has spent 4 grueling hours tracking a Japanese transport, fat and slow, a perfect target. "Bearing, mark," he whispers, the tension in the control room palpable. The men stand motionless, their faces catching the faint red glow of the gauges. "Set 4,000 yards, bridge," comes the quiet response. "Tube 1, fire." The entire boat shudders, a hiss, a blast of compressed air, and the signature whoosh of the torpedo leaving the tube. Brown counts the seconds, picturing the Mark 14 torpedo running straight and true. It is America's finest subsurface weapon, supposedly. 13 seconds, 14, 15. "Target!" The sailor on the sonar headset calls out the impact, a solid metallic thump. Brown smiles, relief flooding his face, but the smile vanishes as quickly as it came. "What was that?" The sonar operator hesitates. "Captain, I still hear screws. The transport is still moving." Brown slams his fist onto the periscope mount. He lowers the scope, turning to face his executive officer. A dud on a perfect hit! This moment, this failure was repeated hundreds of times in the first devastating months of the war. Pearl Harbor had crippled the fleet, but the U.S. Navy's submarine force, based mostly in Manila and later Perth, was its only real offensive weapon against the Japanese logistical chain. Yet these submarines were being betrayed by the very weapon they carried, the standard Mark 14 torpedo, and its intricate heart, the Mark 6 magnetic exploder. The torpedoes either ran 10 feet deeper than they were set, passing harmlessly beneath the enemy keel, or they hit the target squarely, only to refuse to detonate. The Navy's official doctrine, established in the peacetime bureaucracy of the 1930s, insisted the torpedo was perfect. Officers who reported failures were dismissed as inexperienced, nervous, or incompetent. Their logs were discounted. The designers, cloistered in the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, refused to believe the engineers had made a mistake. The cost of this institutional arrogance was staggering. Months of precious time, dozens of irreplaceable veteran submarines, and hundreds of millions of gallons of enemy fuel and materiel that slipped through the cracks. The men in the steel tubes of the Pacific were fighting 2 wars, one against the Imperial Japanese Navy and one against their own Navy's defective weapon. But as the frustration boiled over in the Pacific, the solution was already being sought, not by the old guard of admirals and engineers, but by a handful of dedicated, overlooked personnel, including mathematicians and technicians far from the front line. The torpedo problem was about to be turned over to the sharpest minds available, minds previously considered secondary to the war effort.
Spring 1942. The Naval Torpedo Station, NTS, Newport, Rhode Island. The NTS was a fortress of American naval tradition, its massive brick buildings holding generations of secrets and flaws. For decades, the Bureau of Ordnance, Bureaud, had treated the Mark 14 torpedo as an untouchable dogma, its design perfected in the theoretical isolation of peacetime. Testing was done in shallow, predictable waters off Newport and never with live warheads, ensuring that its 3 fundamental flaws remained hidden: its propensity to run too deep, its unreliable Mark 6 magnetic exploder, and its sheer failure to detonate on direct contact. But the desperate pleas and furious logs from commanders like Wes Brown could not be ignored forever. The official response remained denial, but behind the scenes, pressure was mounting to find the flaw without publicly admitting error. Into this highly secure, overwhelmingly male bastion of engineering tradition stepped a new kind of workforce. Mathematicians, physicists, and human computers, many of them young women hired to solve complex differential equations and analyze mountains of test data. Unlike the senior engineers, who were bound by decades of design pride, these newcomers approached the problem with a fresh, ruthless logic. They were technicians, not traditionists. One such person was Lieutenant Commander Swede Mommsen, a maverick submariner given the thankless task of investigating the Torpedo's performance. He couldn't get a new design, so he had to fix the one they had. Mommsen was convinced the Mark VI magnetic exploder, a complicated secret device designed to detonate the torpedo under the enemy ship's keel for maximum damage, was the source of the depth problem. Mommsen's team began to conduct the first true scientific analysis the torpedo had ever seen. The depth mechanism was simple, a hydrostatic piston. Yet, test after test showed that the torpedo consistently ran 10 to 12 feet deeper than the setting on its depth mechanism indicated. Why? The simple logic of the NTS engineers was that the mechanism was perfectly calibrated. It was the civilian technicians and junior officers who suggested the horrifyingly simple answer. The NTS testing equipment was calibrated wrong. The tool used to test the piston sensitivity, the device that assured the Navy the torpedo was accurate, was defective. When the depth setter was finally tested against a precise pressure gauge, the error was confirmed. The setting dials were inaccurate by a margin that guaranteed the torpedoes sailed harmlessly beneath their targets. This revelation was the first crack in Bureau's arrogance. It was a failure of instrumentation, a mistake so basic that the highly educated engineers had simply overlooked it. The quick fix, a simple adjustment to the depth-setting plates in the torpedo tubes, began immediately. But the second and potentially most catastrophic flaw remained: the magnetic exploder. Even when the torpedoes hit dead on, they often failed to explode. The puzzle required a mind capable of abstract thinking and tireless calculation, the kind of work being done by the women who were beginning to run the calculations at NTS.
Late 1942. The USS Tinosa, SS-283, somewhere in the Pacific. If the depth problem was embarrassing, the contact problem was maddening. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Brown and dozens of other commanders had adjusted their depth settings, yet the failures continued. The magnetic exploder was notorious for triggering prematurely or simply failing to function. So, following orders to bypass the magnetic feature, Brown relied on the contact pistol, the mechanical detonator designed to fire upon direct impact with the ship's hull. Target is a large oil tanker, range 1,200 yards, set depth 6 feet, contact pistol only, Brown instructs. This is a crucial, high-value target. He fires a spread of 4 Mark 14s. The entire crew strains to hear the familiar clank of metal on metal, followed by the deep, shattering roar of a functional warhead. Clank, 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 clank. 4 solid hits, 4 metallic thuds. Silence. The tanker sails on, unperturbed. The moment is captured in the log of the Tinosa, a record of utter failure. The contact pistol, the last fail-safe, was also fatally flawed. The contact mechanism was so delicate that when it hit a target straight on, the force of the impact deformed the internal firing pin mechanism before it could activate the detonator. Instead of exploding, the torpedo simply broke apart against the enemy hull. The furious reports from the Pacific Fleet piled up on the desks of the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C., but the senior engineers, still clinging to their pride and the flawed pre-war test data, were either unwilling or institutionally unable to investigate. They had never tested a torpedo by actually hitting a steel plate at full speed. To do so would have meant sacrificing an expensive warhead, something forbidden in peacetime budgetary culture. The solution came not from D.C., but from the persistent, evidence-based skepticism of the submarine fleet itself. A small number of commanders, tired of sacrificing their lives to a defective weapon, began unauthorized live-fire tests on open ocean. They fired dud torpedoes at cliff faces, salvage nets, and even, famously, old derelict ships. It was in these unofficial, empirical trials that the contact pistol flaw was proven. At the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, a team including Lieutenant Commander Mumson and brilliant civilian mathematicians like Dr. Elizabeth Scott, known as the human computers, began the exhaustive, often tedious work of translating the field data into verifiable mechanical and hydrodynamic truths. They analyzed the speed, the angle, and the impact forces required to trigger the contact pin versus the forces that caused its collapse. They discovered the exact parameters for the fatal failure. The mathematicians, by treating the torpedo not as a sacred weapon but as a cold equation, were able to precisely model the impact deformation that the NTS engineers had missed for years. This quiet, intense intellectual labor culminated in a critical shift. The official Navy finally sanctioned live-fire tests on derelict barges. The tests, overseen by the very officers who had suffered the failures, proved the mathematical models correct. The contact pistol was immediately modified with a stronger, simpler firing mechanism. By mid-1943, with the depth and contact issues mechanically solved through the sheer will of field officers and the analytical power of the technical staff, the submarine fleet finally had a reliable weapon. The women who charted the fatal failure may never have fired a shot, but their calculations were already saving lives and sinking Japanese ships.
Mid-1943. Aboard the USS Wahoo and the USS Gato, Pacific Ocean. The changes were not heralded by grand announcements from Washington. They were felt in the close-quarters confines of the American submarine fleet as a simple, profound truth. The torpedoes worked. The modified depth-setting plates were in place. The flawed magnetic exploder, once the crowning pride of Buord, was routinely disabled, or, in the face of continued unreliability, quietly removed. And critically, the new, tougher contact pistol was functioning. The shift in the war beneath the waves was immediate and devastating to the Japanese. Commander Dudley Mush Morton, commanding the famed USS Wahoo, became a legend. His attack reports no longer filled with the frustration of duds, but with the triumphant sinking of tankers and troop transports. The Gato-class submarines, once hampered by defective weaponry, began their relentless attrition campaign against the Japanese merchant fleet. This turn of events was the final, crushing outcome of the meticulous, unglamorous work done thousands of miles away. It was the result of a scientific, pragmatic approach championed by commanders in the field and executed by the mathematicians and engineers at the Newport Torpedo Station, many of whom were women working in roles of unprecedented technical responsibility. They had translated complex hydrodynamic and ballistic data, the speed of the torpedo, the pressure of the ocean, the structural integrity of the tiny firing pin, into a working weapon. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained unaware of the American torpedo crisis. They had assumed the initial low sinking rates were due to poor American seamanship or caution. When the sinking rate abruptly tripled and quadrupled in 1943, they attributed it to increased numbers of U.S. submarines, failing to grasp that the effectiveness of each submarine had suddenly multiplied tenfold. The truth was that the silent, intellectual victory won in the laboratories and testing grounds of Rhode Island was now manifesting as material destruction across the vast Pacific. The Mark 14 torpedo, finally a reliable weapon, helped choke the flow of oil, rubber, and iron ore to the Japanese home islands, turning the Imperial Navy into a land-bound force. The women who ran the equations, calculated the drag coefficients, and proved the deformation flaw of the contact pistol were the unseen heroes of the campaign. They didn't receive commendations for sinking enemy ships, but their victory over institutional arrogance and flawed engineering was arguably one of the most important technical achievements of the American war effort, saving the submarine force from an internal defeat that would have jeopardized the entire Pacific strategy. By mid-1943, the subforce, now armed with a functioning weapon, was doing the job it was designed for, setting the stage for the strategic strangulation of the Japanese Empire.